am Hannah Smith, and I'm the horticulture agent in Guilford County, and I am very excited to be with you guys this morning to talk about flowers and herbaceous ornamentals. And so what we're going to do as a part of this presentation, and I have about an hour and a half, so we'll try to get through all of it. We're going to talk about how plants flower and some of the fun details like that, and talk about some of the site considerations that you need, then talk about some design considerations, and then talk about annuals, perennials, and then also a little bit about bulbs as well. And so I do have a boot on this morning. I have a stress fracture, and so I'm actually going to sit up here to keep some weight off of my foot. I hope that's okay with everyone and that you can see me. But we will go ahead and get started so that hopefully we can get through this presentation. I realized when I got here at about 5 till that this is actually, this is the presentation, but I actually made a few tweaks to it. So if I skip over some slides, that may be why. Is this, okay, there we go. All right, so first of all, we're going to start out with why plants flower. So basically, a plant's purpose is to reproduce, especially for the annuals. And we'll talk about what makes the difference between annuals and perennials. But basically, plants want to flower and set seed so that they can ensure the species' survival. And so it's important to have plants that the flowers are produced at the right time of the year, because if they're at the wrong time of the year, there may not be a pollinator available to pollinate the other flowers, to make sure that pollination occurs and the plant continues to survive. And it also may not be enough time to set a successful seed, which is needed for the flower to reproduce as well. So what causes flowering? So this is important, where you have to have the bud change from a vegetative part to a reproductive part. And this process is called evocation. And so basically, this is where your juvenile plants can't flower, so they have to become an adult. But the conditions have to be right for this to happen. And basically, evocation is evoking a response from the plant tissue, changing the plant's function. So the juvenile to adult transformation basically is where there's hormonal changes that occur, and it's induced by those transition factors. So basically, this is where it can be determined by size rather than the age. So number of leaves may be an important factor, and even this is something that you think about with roses and even with pruning and things like that, number of leaves is important, but also growth conditions as well. So if the plant is under stress, it may prolong that juvenile stage. So that's where it's really important when we start talking about the site considerations, providing those proper site conditions in that kind of right plant, right place. And then also day length is another thing that can trigger flowers. So this is important. A lot of times we like to think of poinsettias as being one of those that's triggered by day length. Some are short day plants, some are long day plants, and then you've got some that are actually day neutral plants as well. And I think I actually have specifics about those types, like the day length I do. Okay, so it's this one. So these are kind of some of the environmental signals where you've got the photoperiod, which is the night length, more important than the day length. So it's kind of confusing to think about a short day plant actually means that there's long nights. So those are the ones that usually flower in the spring and in the fall. And then you've got the long day plants, which is where they have shorter nights. So it's the light, the night that's important. And even with poinsettia production, sometimes they'll put them in greenhouses and vary the light, or maybe in a greenhouse in certain production situations where they'll actually have flashes of light that are triggered throughout the night to break the night periods up. And so it's kind of interesting when you get into that, and then even talking about the different types of light. You've got red and green and the different wavelengths and all of that. It's actually really interesting. If that's something that I would suggest you look into that if you find that interesting, because it is. There's a lot of information out there about that. A lot of research being done on that. And then there are day-neutral plants where really it's more of being triggered by the temperature versus the actual length of the night. So this is then where we're going to get into the planning, the preparing, and the planting. So this is just kind of like the roadmap slide of the different sections that we're going to be talking about from this point on. So, and this is one that's very, very important, and I like to put this in there for the herbaceous ornamentals presentation, but for a lot of my presentations that I do, because as gardeners, we tend to go to a garden center or a plant sale, plant swap, and we see this plant and we have to have it. I was getting my hair done yesterday afternoon, and my hairdresser's into plants, and she was like, I get all these plants on the sale rack at Lowe's, and they look so sad, and I want to make them look better, and then I take them home, and then I have to figure out what to do with it, and my husband gets so mad at me, and I was like, I know. That's what gardeners do. Because we see something and we want to nurture it back to health, or it's just got these great flowers on it for whatever reason. And then we try to take it out into the garden and then try to find a place to put it. And oftentimes what may happen then when we put it out in the garden like that is it may not survive as well, or we may find ourselves having to go out and dig it up and put it in another spot. How many of you have moved a plant around several times because you had to put it, yeah, okay. So you know what that is, and you try to wait for it to flower, or it doesn't look as healthy as it should, and then you wonder what is wrong. Then you dig it up after it dies, and then you start a compost pile. And so that may not be the best approach. And so this is where we've got this right plant, right place, where you got you start with a plan. So you analyze your conditions and you choose plants that fit those conditions. That's the easier way. And then, like I said previously, the harder way, which is choosing plants you love and then trying to either put it in a spot that may not be best suited for, or you try to change the conditions in the area to suit the needs of the plant. And sometimes you can change the conditions, you can amend the soil to a certain extent, you can change the pH if it needs to go a little higher, so on and so forth. But sunlight is something that you can't do a whole lot about. And so, that's one that it's very important to look at the amount of sunlight you have, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But then you've got some plants that are adaptable, and some plants that are considered divas. And so the two pictures that I have up here on this slide, actually, the one on the top are daylilies, and those are tough. Those are why you see those on the side of the road in medium plantings, in areas, in parking lots and things like that, because they're very heat and drought tolerant. They're very kind of adaptable to situations. And then the bottom picture is actually Gaillardia, or blanket flower, and that one is a little bit more finicky in terms of at least drainage, where if it doesn't have well-drained soil, it's probably not going to be as happy in that location. And with the clay soils, that's something that's pretty important with that one. So this, I love to keep this picture. It's a little dated at this point, but again, this right plant, right place. So these are some of the things that you want to think about when making that plan ahead of time. So looking at the soil type, whether it's a clay or a sandy soil, and looking at the drainage of it as well, because drainage is very, very important, especially for your long-term plants like your perennials. And then bulbs are also picky about drainage as well, because then if it's not, especially bulbs, if they're not in a well-drained area, the bulbs could potentially rot. And then also the pH is important. And with clay soils, a lot of times they're naturally more acidic. So doing a soil test and figuring out what the pH of it is, whether or not you need to make any adjustments to the pH and to the nutrient levels, is an important step. And then also the sun versus the shade. And then whether or not it's a wet or a dry site, so I mentioned that, and then the mature size. So with herbaceous ornamentals, your flowers and perennials and bulbs, mature size isn't quite as important as for your woody ornamentals, but I do want to, and I'm a big, this is something that I push for, so I have to mention it to you guys, is the mature size. Look at that, whatever the plant database suggests a mature size or the plant tag, and then you actually want to go allow for at least 2 times that mature size. In a Juniper Level Botanical Garden, I actually just posted a post on Facebook yesterday of I think it was a fall cypress, and all the information on the websites, all the info on Google about this fall cypress said that it would only maximum get 10 feet tall. And they have one planted in Juniper Level Botanical Garden that is 25 feet. Oops. So, right, oops, right? I mean, somebody messed up somewhere. So just keep that in mind. This is the NCSU Interactive Plant Guide, the NCSU Plants Database. So this is the website to that. You can also just Google NCSU Plants or NCSU Plants Database and it'll come up. But this is a really great resource for gardeners to look at the plant characteristics, the cultural site conditions that particular plant needs. So you can actually look it up by scientific name or by common name. You can actually, there's a filter on it where you can look for annuals, perennials, ground covers, pollinator plants, so on and so forth. Can look at the light requirements. It'll even tell you whether or not that plant is, sometimes at least, it'll tell you if that plant is a little bit adaptable for soil conditions, or if it really wants, well-drained soil. There's pictures on there, there's descriptions, comments on whether or not it has poisonous characteristics and so on and so forth. It's a really great resource for gardeners, and like to point people to this website because oftentimes I'll get calls and they'll say, what plant do I need to put in this spot? I want a ground cover that gets park shade. And there's so many plants out there that that could go in that spot. So a lot of times I'll refer people to this website and explain how to filter it out. Yes?
Suppose you want plants that would survive in like a really high pH. Will it talk about pH?
It will. It talks about pH and if it's adaptable to different soil conditions and so on and so forth. This website, though, I will say, NCSU, the Horticulture Department, the specialists have gotten a grant. It's a 3-year grant, I believe, and so they're actually updating this entire website, updating the pictures, because some of them are a little, iffy as far as quality, and so they're going to update the pictures, update the information, update the search criteria, and also add short little videos to the most searched plants on there as well. So look for that coming up. They're hoping, the idea is that this website will then become kind of on the same level as your Missouri Botanical Garden, as one of the premier kind of plant database. We hope. We'll see. And I say we because I actually have signed on to do 10 of the videos, so you may see that in the future. All right, so we'll talk about planning now, because this is, again, very, very important to start out with this planning before you start purchasing anything or start going into the garden and digging up and adding. So we'll talk about sunlight. The temperature, I think I actually took that section out of temperature, but basically it was mentioning hardiness zones and making sure that you buy plants that are right for this area. And then topography, water access, and then soil characteristics as well. So first of all, what are your objectives? What do you want out of your garden? So do you want season-long blooms? Do you want to provide food, nectar sources, and habitat for pollinators year-round? Do you want to add some color to a certain area and dress it up? Do you want to provide a habitat for birds and wildlife? Or, do you want to just have an area to experiment with new plants? So you have to think about what you want as a gardener out of your garden. And then you also have to think about what you're willing to do, how much work you're willing to put into this area. And so there's 2 pictures up here, and these are just some kind of suggestions. One at the top one is literally a flower bed, which is kind of a neat idea, right? It's kind of punny. Love that. Yeah, punny. You know, somebody actually, we were talking about my boot yesterday, and they were like, it has drainage holes. You could, when you get done with it, just fill it up with soil and put flowers in it, you know. So all different kinds of ideas, but you have to think about what you want. If you want something unique, but again, also very important, think about how much work you're willing to put into it as well. So first of all, the site considerations, whether you have full sun, part shade, or full shade. So some definitions about what each one of those means. So you've got your full sun, which means you get 3+ hours of unfiltered midday sun. And that is where most of your flowering plants are going to fall. More sun is better for flowers because if any of you have had or have shade gardens or have worked in shade gardens, seen shade gardens, you probably realize that a lot of those shady plants or areas, or plants for shady areas, don't have big showy flowers on them. And so for that flower production to take place, a lot of times, that's why you need sunlight. Even thinking about your vegetable plants. Vegetables need full sun because they flower, so on. So again, full sun, 3+ hours of midday sun, unfiltered midday sun. Then you've got part shade or partial shade, which is where you've got unfiltered morning sun, an afternoon shade, or moderate shading throughout the day. And the reason it's that unfiltered sun in the morning is because morning sun is less harsh than the afternoon sun. So even a lot of times your shade plants can withstand a little bit of that morning sun because it's much gentler. And then there is the shade, which is where you get little to no direct midday light, or less than 60 of intensity for the rest of the day. So a lot of your woodland plants are going to fit into this category, and they kind of thrive in these conditions. So you've got a couple of different examples up there. The top one being your hostas, and so these, again, are ones that have, you don't necessarily plant them for their flowers, or they're not quite as showy, or the bloom time just isn't quite as long. So that's your shade. So you want to, again, think about how much sunlight you have in those areas. And like I said, sunlight is one of those things that you can't do a whole lot about. I mean, you could plant a tree. It may take it a while to grow if you want more shade. You can take a few limbs off of a tree to get a little bit more sunlight, or remove it if that's something that you really, really want. But you also have to think about what kind of shade structures are going to cast as well. And then you've got your topography, which is also very important to think about. So you've got trees, where you've got your trees where roots may stick up out of or be on the top layer of the soil, so it may be hard to plant around those. It may be best to just mulch around that area, but you also need to think about the roots that are going out to the drip line and maybe even a little further around those trees, because those tree roots also need water and nutrients. So if you plant flowers around those tree roots, they're going to be competing with each other for those resources. So you have to take that into consideration. Also, driveways and paths, you have to think about where those are located, because those can actually create microclimates. And so concrete and brick will actually capture heat throughout the day and then re-radiate it back out at night. Even walls and driveways, pathways, and things like that. So if you're planting around that area, the soil temperatures may be on average a little bit warmer. Also the air temperatures as well, so something to consider. And then whether or not the area is sloped or flat. Because if you've got something planted at the top of the slope, it's going to need a little bit more water, because the water is going to drain down to the bottom of that slope. And the same for the bottom of the slope, it may be a little bit wetter of a site, or it may not drain as well. And then also, especially for your herbaceous ornamentals, because oftentimes we're planting those plants for their aesthetic appeal, their aesthetic value. So do you want to be able to see those plants from your kitchen window, from your patio, from your porch? So think about the site in that sense as well, and the visibility of them. Or do you want something that invites guests into your home, into your front door? Because that's kind of even a landscape design consideration as well, where you can lead people to the door that you want them to enter into. And then water access. So water access is also very important, and one of the things that oftentimes slips our mind. So this is important for your flowers because they need about an inch of water per week. Again, you may have some that are a little bit more heat and drought tolerant once they get established, but just a general kind of rule of thumb, about an inch of water per week. And that is whether it's from the rain or whether it's from irrigation. Do want to site the garden in an area where you can have either drag a hose over, hook up a drip irrigation or a soaker hose, because it can get quite cumbersome when you have to drag a watering can several times back and forth to water. And hand watering just isn't as efficient in general, because it's harder to make sure that you only water around the roots, and it's more time consuming than even drip and soaker hose irrigation. And the picture there on the right is showing kind of what a soaker hose does, where it has that kind of permeable material on the outside, and water kind of slowly seeps out of it. So it's a really good option to make sure that you're watering as efficiently as possible. And then, yes?
So I put a cat food can, which is, like maybe a little over an inch, underneath my drip hoses. And that inch in that thing happens very quickly with the soaker hoses even.
Right.
But how do I know that it's actually going that far in the ground? I'm sure this might be soil and percolation, but I'm worried that they're not getting enough water, even though my cat food can
says that it's getting that inch. I guess my best recommendation would be to do the finger test, and then just kind of go out and dig around. And see, and just kind of see how it's seeping in and working in, and if it is going deep enough around the root system.
Well, nothing's drying up and dying, so I guess that's part of it.
That's also a good indicator,
I almost feel like they should get a little more than that cat food.
Right, and I'm kind of with you on that, thinking that I'm not watering enough, and that was something that was very hard for me when I worked in a greenhouse. I actually ended up overwatering a lot of stuff, and then you would get kind of that green, blue algae stuff growth on the top, and I got in trouble because I was overwatering. But I was like, but they need water. There we go. Okay. Which kind of segues into this next point about soil characteristics and how. Yes, water is very important, and plants do need water to survive, but the roots need oxygen as well. So the breakdown is about 25% oxygen, or 25% air, 25% water, and then 45% of that mineral matter, and 5% organic material, or organic matter. And so that's just kind of the ideal soil composition, but most of the time, we don't have ideal soil conditions. There's compaction, where you've got less airspace and maybe even more mineral matter or more water in poorly drained soils. But oftentimes, and when I moved here, because I'm not from North Carolina, I'm actually from Alabama, and we do have clay soils in Alabama as well. But when I moved here, the big thing was, clay soils, they're the worst. And they can be, but they're also really good as well, because they do have good mineral values. They have high CECs, cation exchange capacity. So they're able to exchange nutrients rapidly, but they're also able to kind of mitigate rapid fluctuations in nutrient changes. So the high CEC and clay soils is actually a really good thing. And also, the other point is good water holding capacity that clay soils have. And so Sometimes too good, yes. And so you have to work on the drainage. But with sandier soils and soils that drain really rapidly, you're having to actually water more frequently, and you're actually having to fertilize more frequently as well. So, and it can be easier to over fertilize those areas, having an environmental impact. And so clay soils actually aren't that bad. They kind of tend to have a bad rap. But also, the only bad thing about clay soils is that they do tend to become generally more compacted easier. So that's the other thing. But okay, so I thought it was the next slide, but it's easy, or not easy, but you can add amendments to the soil to help kind of mitigate that compaction and make it the area drain a little bit better. As far as soil moisture and drainage goes, drainage is very important with the clay soils, especially for those plants that need well-drained areas. So you can do a drainage test just to kind of see what that drainage is like in an area, and this is also a very key important point with clay soils and in the planting process, because an area just may not be suitable. And so fill a 10-inch deep hole with water and let it drain, and then fill it up with water again, and then let it drain that second time. And the second time, if it drains in about 8 to 10 hours, then you know it's considered well drained. If it takes longer than that, it's not well drained, and then anything shorter than that 8-hour period may drain a little bit too quickly. So this is just a kind of an easy way to see what the drainage is like in that area. So some other points about soil moisture and drainage. If you have a poorly drained area, you can first choose plants that like areas that stay moist long periods of time. And there are plants out there, rain garden plants. The picture on the bottom there is kind of showing, both of these pictures actually are showing kind of, in a sense, rain gardens where they've got those natural depressions in the topography of the area, and then they've actually just planted plants there to kind of help with the infiltration of the rainwater, the storm water in those areas. And these are kind of, one of them looks like it's next to a roadway, and you're starting to see those pop up even more and more kind of in those natural depressions, drainage areas next to roadsides. But then that bottom one is kind of next to a building. But rain gardens and plants that can go in rain gardens are plants that like those wet sites. You can try to improve your soil with organic matter and work it in over a few years, and that will help improve the drainage. Another idea is to create a raised bed where you can actually amend the soil a little bit easier. Or you can garden in containers. So containers are also another really great option, especially for those areas where it may just be too time consuming to amend the soil. So, and I mentioned containers, so I do have to mention some of the advantages of containers, because I personally, I'm a renter, so I'm not going into my landscape and making huge sweeping changes, because I don't have buy-in to that landscape. So I love containers because they're really great for renters. They're really great for small spaces, but they're also really great for urban areas, maybe where the soil's been compacted due to construction and things like that. And so basically your garden can fit anywhere that you want it, as long as you have the correct sunlight and then enough space for that container to fit. The other positive to containers is that potting medium has the correct pH. It also is made to drain well, to hold the water, so lots of benefits about that. The thing to remember about containers, though, is that you do need to, or will have to water those plants a little bit more frequently in very hot weather, because they'll dry out quicker. But the bigger the container, the more moisture it's going to hold. So you do want to also think about that when choosing the container that you want to put out or put your plants in. And also just some kind of picture examples of different container gardens. You can have an entire garden on a patio entirely of containers. You can fit annuals, perennials. You can even do bulbs in containers. You can do even small trees and things like that in containers as well. So really great option if you have areas that are poorly drained or small space. And so this, kind of wrapping up. Oh, I'm sorry, you had a question. Yes.
Real quick question, as far as containers, because I have a very, like courtyard area that it's hard to get water in there, so it has to be hand water.
Right.
And that's, towards the end of the summer, it gets really, you go away for 2 days, you come back and the plants are dead. So,
Right.
do you have any suggestions for that other than running? What's the best way?
So I have seen drip irrigation in containers, so that may be an option if a water source is close enough to run a drip irrigation line. And I've actually seen drip irrigation out in planters by mailboxes. I'm not sure how they ran the lines, but that's the only other thing that I can think of for larger containers especially. I'm sorry?
Wicking, if you have, and it's been years since I've seen it, so you'll have to do some research. If you have like a bucket, 5 gallon full of water, and then there are certain type substances that you can, so that as the plant dries out, it draws from this.
Interesting.
And also
That's
and you can have timers.
Exactly.
But I also use a timer.
timer, right? Yeah,
Solar
timers.
on the timer.
She's got.
Oh, yes.
Well, I find these things called plant nannies, which are these little terracotta spikes.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you drink a bottle of wine, and then you fill it with water, and you stick it upside down, and it's attractive. It goes through the clay, so it slowly sinks through the clay.
Oh, it actually seeps through the clay. Yes. Okay, so wow. Okay, yes, one more. We have one more suggestion.
You can actually put a bigger, more of a plastic saucer, a deeper one underneath your pot. That way it's a
It's-
reservoir of
Yeah.
water reabsorb the fluid.
Love it. All right, we have one more. Yes.
The other thing is if it's in containers, move the containers.
Well, they're pretty heavy.
Yeah, and they can't, especially if you've got. I think it's. I think we did the math at one point or tested it. A 20-inch diameter container with soil and a plant and moist soil can weigh over 100 pounds. So you do have not carts, but wheels that you can put containers on.
Yeah.
So if you have a large container, that may be also another idea as well. Okay, so now we'll move on to, so I do have to mention this, because I feel like you always have to talk about this with everything, but I did mention it earlier, how important it is to soil test, but do want to just point out again, I feel like in extension, like if I don't mention this, they might fire me, because they're like, soil test, we have to talk about it. But it's a very critical part of that planting process. So if you are doing in-ground planting, do a soil test first. It's free now that it's after April 1st. It's going to be free until Thanksgiving, so get those soil tests done. Really great information that comes from those. So now we'll move on to the preparing part, the site preparation. So the first thing to think about is what your goals are as far as soil improvement. So of course, either to correct the soil pH if that is something that's not in range. Also any fertility issues that may be in the area. Also adding organic matter to reduce the soil compaction and then minimizing these sort of drainage problems as well. I feel like that one slide was out of place. That's okay. So your soil test results, have you guys had a soils class? Okay, so you know about what the soil test results, what each one of these sections means, but I do want to mention, and it may be hard to see on this one, but there is a code for flower garden. So as what you probably have learned in your soils class, the correct code is very important for what crop you're planning to plant. So do want to just point that out. I love this slide just to kind of show a comparison of what the correct soil pH actually does to the root system. So this was an experiment that was done, just kind of showing where your lower pH 5.2, much shorter than those roots at 6.5 pH, which is very important, especially helping with establishment of the plant and drought tolerance, because the roots are able to go much deeper to tap into some of that water that may be a little bit lower down as the top areas dry out. So in your preparation, one of the important things to do is to control the weeds. Because if you let them get out of hand in a garden area and you don't get on top of them quickly, they can get out of hand very fast. So you've got 3 different options. And you've got mechanical and cultural, which is the 2 that you should be working towards first. And chemical control should always be the last resort, but it may sometimes be warranted for chemical control because there may be some of those tough weeds. From the weedy grasses such as Bermuda grass, which can be such an issue in flower beds, creeping into flower beds, but also even some of the weedy vines like English ivy. Especially I've got an area in my backyard, English ivy is everywhere, and so getting a handle on that, and sometimes you can cut and physically remove it, that mechanical control, but sometimes you may also have to resort to other methods as well. But hand pulling or using a hoe or something like that to get them, make sure that you get them when they're young before they set seed, especially for those annual weeds, because we like the saying 1 year's weed equals 1 year's seed equals 7 years weeds. And some of the weed seeds can persist for quite a number of years. So get a jump on those. And some of them can have Japanese stiltgrass, which isn't as common in flower beds, but it is such a problem. One Japanese stiltgrass has over like 100,000 seeds on one plant. It's crazy. So get them before they set seed. And then cultural mulching, mulch. It's very important to have that mulch in place, and that is in your preparation. Right after you plant, put the mulch down, and then continue adding layers of mulch so that those weed seeds aren't able to germinate. Because especially your organic mulches are going to break down over time, so make sure to keep that those 3 to 4 inches or so. Make sure it stays at that depth. And then I did kind of talk about a chemical do. And I also just mentioned that if you are going to use a chemical control, to always read and follow the label directions. So as far as preparing the planting bed, you do, again, plant roots need oxygen, they need moisture, and they need nutrients. So make sure to loosen that soil to a depth of about 10 inches or so. And then when you finish loosening up that soil, just try to make sure not to walk on it, because that's going to compact it back down. And then when you're preparing your planting bed at that time, that's when you would incorporate any of your amendments or your fertilizer if you need to add any. Again, what's recommended on your soil test. And the top picture is just kind of showing someone working the soil, and then that bottom picture is probably pretty common in where it has a small bed like that. But once it's tilled like that, make sure just not to walk on it. Yes?
Is 10 inches the recommendation for a new planting bed, or for prepping a planting bed after it's been dormant for the winter?
I would say this is probably for a new planting bed, but it probably wouldn't hurt if the area has been compacted in the past to work it to that 10 inches or so.
Because we've gotten different levels of instruction about disturbing soil.
Well, okay, so
surface.
right, and there is the kind of the thought that just, are you meaning disturbing the soil, bringing the weed seeds to the top?
Yes, till versus no till.
Right. So there are different, and yes, there's different, and so this is just kind of a general what I say, but Yeah. I give you the information and then you can decide what you would like to do. Okay? Yeah. As far as incorporating organic matter, so what to use: compost, aged manures, pine bark, even maybe rotted leaves that have been broken down or mowed up. What not to use: vermiculite, peat moss. Peat moss, no. Especially because peat moss holds moisture very well. So adding it to clay soils that holds moisture really well is not a good combo. Perlite as well, and then sand. And oftentimes it's thought of sand is going to add better drainage, but clay and sand actually kind of turns into brick. Yeah, and it kind of does the opposite. As far as incorporating it in, kind of general recommendation: incorporate 2 to 3 inches to the top, kind of 6 to 8 inches, 10 inches. And then as far as compost, so just mentioning that it's a really great organic matter amendment to the soil. Compost has so many different benefits. Doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of NP and K in it though. So you can have your compost analyzed, whether you're getting it from a municipal source or a bulk source, or if you have your own compost. The agronomic division at NCDA does, I think it's the solutions analysis or plant waste analysis division. It's on their website. But that you can send compost in and get a report back, kind of like a soil sample, and it'll tell you what's the nutrient levels are in that. Yes?
I totally get that compost is better because it's an organic matter. And I really don't want to use vermiculite and perlite, but I watch a couple of gardening programs and I keep seeing it mentioned. Mainly though when plants are potted up. And I just wanted to know what's wrong with them, or why shouldn't I use them?
I just don't know if it has as much benefit. Yes, you're right. It is oftentimes an additive in potting soil, almost always in potting soil. But as far as in-ground gardening, and it doesn't break down as much as some of the organic matter, doesn't have as many of the, doesn't attract the microorganisms and things like that for the compost.
It's just not as beneficial.
Right,
But
right.
it's not sort of toxic.
No, right. It's not toxic. It's just not gonna, and it doesn't even, like with the sand and the clay, create kind of a bad situation. It's just not as beneficial. Yes. Yes.
Feel free to say this isn't part of your talk, but I just read in Carolina Gardening magazine about this mixture of sand and compost. If your lawn is lumpy, that you can spread that out over time. Would that have the same problems with the sand, clay, cement problem as this was specifically for Carolina?
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of that?
I have not, and I haven't seen that article, so I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm just not sure about that. Yeah. Okay, so design considerations as far as plant selection. So we talked about the light needs, also drainage and moisture, but also think about the mature size and whether or not support's going to be needed. And we'll talk about that kind of in the maintenance section. And then disease resistance, because that is also an important, especially for like zinnias, which are a little bit more prone to powdery mildew, and then the impatiens with the impatiens downy mildew problems that have been happening on some of the impatiens. So you do want to think about disease resistance. And then the design considerations of what works with your style, what kind of planting you want, what works for your budget, and then the special features that I mentioned earlier that you think about, and then also the color, season, and length of bloom as well, so that you can get all of those blooming when you would like. So do you want to have massing for a drastic impact? This is oftentimes done with annuals, where annuals are actually planted probably much closer together just because they're short-lived or shorter-lived than your perennials. And then thinking about multi-season interest so that you can have 3 growing seasons worth of blooms, and that has a lot to do with that wildlife benefit as well, providing food sources for pollinators throughout the year. And then color combinations as well and their effects. So this one's just about primary colors, you know, the red, the yellow, the blue, and those kind of, you know, how those work together. And this is just kind of some, you know, fun stuff about colors. But you do have, you know, your primary colors, but the complementary colors is really what I kind of wanted to hone in on as far as the color section. Because complementary colors are the colors that are directly across from each other on the color wheel. So you got red and green, for example, and those are your, kind of your Christmas colors. And one of the things that I noticed being, you know, in the SEC with like football and things like that, and is that, you know, a lot of the even college colors will be sort of complementary colors. So you got, you know, orange and blue. We've seen a lot, and one of the combinations that I like a lot is violet or purple and yellow. That was my, you know, high school colors. Complementary colors are across from each other on the color wheel. And then when they're side by side, they do present a strong contrast. They work well together, but they do contrast each other pretty strongly. So if that's an impact that you're going for in the landscape, complementary colors may be what you want to go with. And then you've got analogous or adjacent colors, which are colors that are all side by side on the color wheel. So these kind of have more of a subtle effect in terms of, you know, what kind of effect they have on the landscape. They harmonize or blend together well, and so you got, you know, kind of the reddish purples and blues in this one, which all work really nice together. And then this one here has got kind of the green, the lighter green on the margins of this hosta, and then that kind of yellowy orange daylily, which makes a really nice color combination there. And then you've got monochromatic, which is where you've got all of just one color. And then your warm colors, which are a little bit more lively, a little bit more energetic. They come forward in the landscape, so they seem a little bit closer than they really are. So that can be a consideration with your landscape design if you want something to pop a little bit more. These are your oranges, your yellows, and your reds. And then you've got your cool colors, which are kind of have that calming effect and recede a little bit more. So if you want a serene area, maybe you've got a fountain or another sort of water feature nearby, and planting these kind of cool colors in that area would be a nice little reprieve from a stressful day or something like that. And then you've got your neutral colors, which are good backgrounds or accents to other colors in the landscape. And white is actually the last color to fade at night. And so maybe you or guests or, you know, someone in your family may get home after dark often. And it may be nice to plant white flowers along that walkway, just to kind of have that nice color effect as the light is fading throughout the night. So that's another consideration. So now we'll go into the specifics about annuals, biennials, a little bit about biennials, then perennials, and bulbs. So we're going to try to get through this. All right, so plant selection. First of all, do you want seeds or do you want transplants? Good question. I don't know. It depends. That's a question. That's the answer a lot of times to some of these questions. Well, it depends. But some of the things for seed, they are a little bit less expensive. But they're also slower to flower. They may also be a little bit harder to germinate. Some plants may be harder to germinate from seed. But on the other side of that, you do have greater variety because nurseries, greenhouses, garden centers, they only grow unless, you know, you go somewhere like Plant Delights where they're into those unique kind of different plants. But your mainstream garden centers and places like that are only going to sell what's popular. So if you want something that's unique and you don't want to go to Plant Delights and play Plant Delights prices, then you can start them from seed because there's several catalogs out there where you may get some interesting varieties. Transplants, again, on the flip side of that, do have a little bit of a higher cost because more work has been put into it to get to that point. But you get sort of that instant gratification, which oftentimes is what gardeners are looking for. And then another positive about the transplants is you don't have to do that thinning. Because if you have your seeds that, if you have your seeds that you're sowing, it's inevitable that they're not going to be spaced correctly, and so you're going to have to go in and thin some of those out, which is another step in the process to get to that final product. But the other side of that is, as gardeners, something that we've nurtured, we hate to just mow it down with a pair of scissors, or at least I do. So another thing for transplants. And I do want to mention, just as far as looking for transplants, you do want to look for healthy transplants that are free of insects and diseases and that has that nice, good root system on it. So if you've pulled a plant out and it looks like that, then you know you've got a good one with those nice, fine root hairs and kind of that white or cream-colored root system. Compact foliage and side branching with good color also something to think about, and then you know, kind of non-flowering plants as well, so that you know a lot of that energy is put into a good root system and not necessarily flowers. All right, so we'll move on to annuals. So the classification or characteristics of annuals is that they complete their entire life cycle within 1 year. So they grow, flower, and set seed within 1 year. And their mission is to set seed. And these are the ones that have the longest bloom season and sort of that quickest to bloom. Because sometimes your perennials may only bloom for a couple of weeks, but you can have annuals that will actually bloom throughout an entire summer. So you'll get that kind of continual color with annuals. They are relatively versatile, and so this is one that you can kind of maybe dial back on that right plant, right place a little bit, because they're only going to last for, again, 1 growing season. And so you may be able to put them in an area where the growing conditions aren't. Sunlight, you need sunlight, especially for the flowers, but you know, other things, again, they're only growing for that 1 season. Oftentimes very easy to find and easy to grow, and relatively inexpensive as well. So you do have a few different types of annuals. You've got hardy, which are the cool season that grow in kind of the spring and the fall, and some examples of that. I've got a picture up here of a pansy, and pansies are not pansies because they do like cooler weather. And so you've got pansies, snapdragons is another example of one that would be a cool season annual. And then you've got half hardy, which are sort of, you know, a borderline. Oftentimes these are treated as annual, or you know, on the lines of between the hardy and the tender. And then, but the 2 main ones are the hardy, and then you've got the tender, which are your warm season plants. And so I've got a picture up here of marigolds, which is kind of your classic warm season plant, but there's several warm season plants out there. Some more, okay, so I got specifics on it. Cool season, or your hardy annuals, are actually the most cold tolerant. So these are the ones that tolerate light frost, and maybe even some freezing weather. Again, those pansies, you see those a lot, because they do withstand those. And they even may die back a little bit with a really cold night, and sometimes they'll perk back up when it gets a little bit warmer. So very good hardy plants. And these are not heat tolerant. Once we start hitting, you know, 75, 80 degrees, they're going to just kind of poop out and not be happy anymore. And then I did mention that some do overwinter depending on the weather. Got 2 pictures. Again, I did mention the snapdragons and the pansies as well. And then warm season annuals, or your tender annuals, these are the ones that have those kind of tropical regions, and they're sensitive to cold, so they may be easily damaged. And so these are the ones that you really want to wait. Even now, you know, the past few nights have gotten kind of cold, so you probably wouldn't want to put your begonias and your marigolds out just yet. You may want to wait just a little bit longer, kind of with those warm season vegetables along those lines. And this is where you have most of your annuals are going to fall into this warm season. category. And I don't have it in here, but I can run out, I will run out and get it. I do have a handout for you guys, or I can get it to Ashley and she can get it to you. Yes?
We'll put it on the website.
Or she'll put it on the website. Because this presentation actually, I took it out for time's sake, but it has, it's a plant list. This kind of part of the presentation is a plant list presentation. And so I took that plant list and then just put it on paper for you guys. So just kind of some suggestions of some of those cool season annuals, warm season, even perennials, and so on. And then also some suggestions for some shade plants. Because I know that that's one that if you have a shady area, you kind of bang your head against the wall trying to find something that'll fit in that. So I have some suggestions for that as well. So I'll get that for you guys. And then quickly, just a little bit about biennials, because there's not a whole lot of biennials out there. And so the two pictures you've got foxglove and hollyhock, but these are the ones that basically have kind of a basal mound of foliage in the first year, and then they flower and set seed and die in that second year. So biennial, that 2 season of growth. And so for these, you would sow seed in midsummer, where they'll leaf out and flower the next year oftentimes. So that's where sometimes you can get them to have leaves and flower within that same year. And then perennials. So perennials are ones that grow for several years, hopefully at least for several years. Some may be a little bit more short-lived perennials, and some may persist. And even, like hellebores, where, they pop up and then you have to start dividing them and give them to your friends. But I do love hellebores. But these die back oftentimes in the fall to the crown, and then the roots and the top growth will resume in the spring once it starts warming up again. And so these are the ones that I mentioned earlier. They have a shorter bloom length. 6 weeks is kind of the edge of the most amount of time that you can get for a perennial to bloom. And so, but perennials are really great for garden areas, and there's lots of different choices out there, and several different colors and varieties and things like that. So really great choice. And there are different types of perennials as well, so do want to mention that, and also do want to mention that oftentimes some of the bulbs are just sold as perennials and not even as bulbs as what we would think. So, but there are tender and half-hardy perennials where they may survive a warm winter and they may come back, they may not, and then you've got hardy perennials which will come back with little or no protection. And so sometimes they may be kind of marginal, and if you kind of mulch around the crown and protect them with either mulch or leaf litter or something like that, you may give them a better chance of these tender or half-hardy ones. And the picture that I have here is of different types of coneflower, and even this varies even within the coneflowers. And so you've got your traditional, your purple coneflower, which is hardy, but some of these other cultivars or varieties, I'm not sure which the proper term is, coneflowers may not be as hardy. So you do have to think about that even within the same species. And so, yeah, the half-hardy grown as perennials. So some examples of some of these tender would be lantana, floricox, geraniums, and even some salvias. And then as far as dividing perennials, and this may be part of the maintenance section, but I did want to put this info in here just about dividing them, because oftentimes we'll get calls about, the middle of my perennial is dying out, or it's not flowering, or it doesn't look as good. Irises and the name just left me. Some of those that you need to divide. And so then they're like, have you divided it within the past 3 to 5 years? No. Well, then you probably need to divide it. But this is either to rejuvenate or even for propagation, and to control the spread, maybe like the hellebores, where they'll pop up and have little bitty tiny ones. But what I thought was important about this is that you have your spring blooming ones that you divide in the fall. And then your fall bloomers you divide in the spring. And then your summer ones you can divide either spring or fall. And so kind of gives you an idea of when to do that division. And so September, October is kind of the ideal time for those fall divisions. Excuse me. And that just allows for enough time for it to kind of harden off before freeze. So it allows for better establishment.
Sorry, you said fall bloomers in the spring, spring bloomers in the fall, and then you said
Summer can either be spring or fall.
What would you consider hellebores? Are they a spring or a winter? I mean, mine bloom everywhere.
Right. Yeah, I would say that would be a spring.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just curious.
And then just some examples of how to divide, sometimes you may be able to do it with your hands or maybe even with a couple of shovels. Sometimes you may need to get the axe involved. It just depends. If it hasn't been divided in a while, you may have to hack at it. And you can divide them into half, into fours, depending on how large it is. So this is the maintenance section. So just kind of some of the things that we'll talk about in this section. And so the big point is planting at the proper time. And so you do want to do the planting process first and make sure you got the right plant in the right place. Then also want to look at those average last frost dates. And so that you're planting at the right time so that it doesn't get damaged by maybe some of those late frosts or freezes. And a lot of your perennials can be planted in the fall or kind of the early springtime. And for root prep, which is an important thing, just especially if it looks like this, where it just kind of stays in a pot, it's just a good idea to when you remove the plant from the pot to loosen it up and just kind of massage it a little bit. And you're not going to hurt the plant by doing that. Sometimes you may even have to cut through some of the roots, and that's okay too. And then the other very important thing is to set them at the same depth as they were in the pot. And then also the other important thing after you put it in the soil and put the soil back around it is to water it in and make sure that you give it a good drink. So as far as proper watering, so I've already mentioned about 1 inch of water per week, but for your seedlings and your transplants, you want to keep them consistently moist. So that's very important to make sure that they get good establishment, is to keep them consistently moist. And then you can start watering more deeply and less frequently once they become established. And kind of the way that is for your perennials, even shrubs and trees, the way to kind of remember how long it takes something to get established is the first year it sleeps, second year it creeps, third year it leaps. So on average about 3 years to become established. And then you do want to water the soil, not the plant. In the Piedmont, North Carolina, in this area, we do have issues with a lot of issues with fungal diseases. And that's kind of across the board on all different types of plants. And so when it rains and with Mother Nature and the humidity that we have in this area, there's not a whole lot we can do about the moisture in the air. But at least us as gardeners can do our part to reduce the amount of moisture on the leaves by watering the roots and not the leaves. And leaves just aren't designed or just not created to absorb water droplets that are on the leaves. And then do have to remember that even drought-tolerant plants do need to be watered until they're established. And then mulch is very important to conserve the soil moisture, conserve soil moisture so that you don't have to water as much, and also improving the soil structure because they do decompose and add organic matter back into the soil. Also moderates soil temperature and shades out weeds. So mulch, mulch, mulch. And then your weed control, this is, so we talked about preparing the planting bed, but this is after the plants have been planted. So the cultural would be that mulch to shake out the weed seeds, and then remove by hand. Or by cultivation, such as with a scuffle hoe. And this is actually, I did a vegetables presentation yesterday and actually was reading the Master Gardener Handbook and was talking about the different types of hoes that you can use in the garden. And the scuffle hoe, I think it's like the tobacco hoe is the other one. That's actually most recommended to use because it scratches the top of the surface and removes the weed, and you're not digging down into the soil and stirring up those weed seeds and bringing them to the top. And then again with the chemical control, always be a last resort and always read and follow the label direction, especially in beds that have plants in them. You have to be very careful applying any herbicide around any of the plants in the area, especially because a lot of times you've got Bermuda grass that'll creep in, but if you've got crabgrass or something like that, you're going to have to use a broadleaf herbicide, and broadleaf herbicides can damage ornamental plants. So you have to be very, very careful if that's something you're going to use. And then supplemental fertilization, and so this is what's added to the area after you've planted. And you may have made those initial amendments according to the soil test as far as fertilizer, but this is after you've planted and after those plants have been growing in the area for some time. But again, still important not to over apply because then you'll have runoff into the water system and it causes environmental impacts. So always follow the soil test recommendations. And so if you're ever questioning what kind of fertilizer to put out, you can do another soil sample. And it's always important to do a follow-up sample, a soil sample, if you've made any major improvements to the area. And then slow-release fertilizers are good in the sense that you don't have to apply them as often. And so that this section here is just kind of mentioning that you can apply them maybe just before planting according to soil sample results, and then maybe midway through the growing season. But again, do read and follow the label directions for those products. And several different formulations, the slow release, slow release products, and you've got kind of liquid products, and then you've got granular products as well, and it will have the formulation nutrient content on the bag. And so as far as maintenance goes, so you've got deadheading and pruning. So deadheading is important, especially for annuals, to get better blooming on them, because like I mentioned earlier, the whole purpose of an annual's life is to bloom or flower, set seed, and die. So by taking off those blooms, it kind of extends the life of that plant. They also may get leggy, so you can prune them back to get kind of more stocky growth. And then your perennials cut them back hard after blooming to encourage new leaf growth from the base. And then staking and sanitation. So if you've got tall plants like cosmos or even some dahlias, or if you're growing some of the cut flower plants that have longer stems, they may need to be staked so that they don't fall over in wind or rain, or just from the weight of the blooms. And so you can stake them. So you apply this or put the stake in the ground, careful not to damage the root system. And so when it's about a third of the mature size is when you would add the stake. And so several different types of stakes that you can use, but you basically want the stake to be about 6 to 12 inches shorter than the mature plant. And then you would tie a piece of string or twine around it, kind of in this figure 8 pattern. So you would loop it around the plant and then loop it back around the stake there. Careful not to tie it too tight. And always want to kind of monitor that staking and twine to make sure that it's not impeding the growth of the plant. And then you do want to, as far as sanitation is concerned in the fall, either remove any kind of dead foliage or maybe some stems and protect the crown growth. Now, I will say though, as far as removing some of the dead stems and things like that, You may want to leave some of those behind just because it does kind of offer shelter, and you've got native bees that will actually nest in some of the stems of perennials and things like that. So you not fully cutting back all of the perennials, but just kind of cleaning up the area, especially those leaves and things like that. And if there's been any sort of disease or insect problem with any of those plants, because sometimes the insects can overwinter in some of that fallen foliage. Yes.
For things like lantana and the big tall
Cantaloupe. Yeah.
So does cutting those down put them at risk in the winter for water getting in and cut branches and then freezing?
I'm not familiar with that happening. Has anybody else had experience with that?
Mine are coming up, but they're coming up from new growth, so it's not.
It's not from.
Do you cut them
I do,
down?
I do.
I got some information about lantana.
Yeah.
Lantana does have a hollow stem, and water will get in there, so they recommend that you don't cut it until you see new growth in the summertime. I mean, in the spring.
Very good. Love it. Love it. All right. And then wrapping up the last part about bulbs. And so bulb is kind of the general word that is used, but there are different types of bulbs or different things that we all kind of lump into this category of bulbs. And so there are true bulbs, like your tulips and your daffodils and lilies, and then you've also got corms. You got tuberous roots, you got rhizomes, and then you've even got an enlarged hypocotyl, which is your cyclamen. So oftentimes we kind of use the word bulb, and it's synonymous across all of these, but just wanted you to be aware that there are actually different parts that are what the flowers come out of. But basically bulbs in all of these things are specialized underground plant parts or storage organs where these plants have kind of evolved to survive harsh conditions. So a lot of our spring blooming bulbs actually come from hot areas with hot, dry summers, and so that's kind of where they've evolved to create these storage organs. And basically to perennialize, you would need very, very good drainage, excellent drainage, or they're gonna rot. And then sometimes they just don't overwinter here, depending on what type of bulb it is and whether or not we have a harsh winter. But just a little bit about selecting bulbs. You do want to choose bulbs that are disease-free. So oftentimes they'll be in perforated bags or maybe even out. But just inspect the bulbs before you purchase them and make sure that they're not mushy or look diseased or have fungal growth on them. And there are many different varieties, different sources, and different colors, and there's so many different types out there. And you do have two different bloom seasons for bulbs. So you've got your spring flowering bulbs, which are kind of that January to May time frame, what we're seeing right now. And then you've got your summer flowering bulbs, which is the June to kind of September time frame. In the spring ones would be, crocus and daffodils, hyacinths, and then you've got the summer ones, and you can even have hardy, half hardy, and tender summer flowering bulbs, and that's kind of like what we were mentioning, the cannas, the calla lilies, and even caladium. For planting of spring flowering bulbs, and this is, bulbs can be a whole different presentation in and of itself, talking about how to do that, planting at the right time, what kind of conditions, the different types and things like that. But kind of generally think about the spring blooming bulbs planted in November or early December. Basically you want to look for those soil temperatures that are around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can find out what the soil temperatures are in your area. It's NC Chronos database, or NC Chronos, and it's the State Climate Office at NC State University, and you can look up the soil temperatures. And I think they even have multiple different sites, so you can look at what that is. And as far as storing them, do store them in a cool, dry place. maybe the refrigerator, but do not store near fruit because that ethylene that's produced by the fruit will actually cause the bulbs to rot. But good drainage, and then in the spring you want sunlight in the spring, but you can plant them near other plants such as trees or around them, because if you think about in the spring, the deciduous trees may not have leaves on them yet, so as long as they're getting that full sun in the spring, you're good to go. You can plant them in several different ways. You can do mass planting or in individual holes. You can even layer bulbs. And then the spacing does depend on the mature size of the plant. So this picture here is showing smaller bulbs that are planted closer together, and then you got your bigger bulbs that are planted a little further apart. But this is the slide that I love. It's talking about the depth planting, or how deep to plant them. So on average, for your small bulbs, you want to go about 5 inches. Your larger ones, about 8 inches. That is measured from the base of the bulb to the top of the mulch, because if you've got 3 inches of mulch on there, but you put them 8 inches deep, that may be too deep to go through the soil and also the mulch as well. So do want to account for that mulch layer being there and your planting depth. And different types, and then I have another picture here. It's a really great kind of illustration to show the different planting depths as well, where you've got your iris and your tuberous begonia kind of up here at the top, and then your daffodils, which is one of your largest bulbs, much deeper down here, kind of that 7, 8, 9 inches deep. It even shows kind of, it's hard, it's a little grainy, but even shows kind of your planting times as well. Daffodils, September, October, lilies in the fall, so on. So I really liked this graph. And then a fun idea, so you can plant bulbs in containers and actually have continuous bloom for several weeks. So you can actually different layers, and even different ideas for what you can put in the layers. For your top layer, your middle, and then your bottom layer. So basically what you would want to do if you're going to do this in a container is you have some sort of well, of course, your drainage holes, but then you would want to put some sort of layer of potting soil down at the bottom. A couple inches thick of potting soil, then you put your layer of bulbs, layer of potting soil, so on and so forth, finishing with a layer of soil on top, or medium on top. So that's just kind of a fun idea if you're in an area where containers are better suited and you love bulbs. I love tulips. So you can do those in containers. Yes?
I've been looking at daffodil bulbs,
Uh-huh.
and now have all these different kinds and different colors and stuff. And then there's like one option that is for naturalizing. So is it a different kind of daffodil bulb that naturalizes?
It's probably a mix. Yeah, what are the bulbs natural?
That sounds like
Yeah, I'm not sure what it means by naturalizing.
What's natural mean? It looks natural because it's a lot of
It means that the bulb spreads more easily.
Right, I know, 'cause
It's a bulb that's
I'm sitting there thinking, like you say, naturalizing, and I think of plants that have naturalized to this area, and that's also a word for invasive. And I'm not saying that bulbs are invasive by any means, but that's kind of where my mind was going when you said that, was that it spreads easier. And I don't know why there's some that do that easier than others, and it may just kind of be a marketing thing as well. For maintenance of spring flowering bulbs, because this is important, because being a horticulture person, it's a little embarrassing to say this, but when I was in high school and in early years in college, never knew why my parents' daffodils would never bloom. And it was because my dad on his lawnmower would get real happy and start mowing them down. So it is important to, once they flower, remove those faded blooms, or you can cut them off and put them in a vase to keep them and have them as an arrangement. But you do want to let that foliage dry out naturally. So basically it means to leave it alone until it's yellow and kind of because those leaves are photosynthesizing, creating energy to store in that bulb for the next year's growth. So a good way to test whether or not you're ready to remove that foliage is to tug on it. Once it turns yellow and kind of falls over, tug on it, and if the leaves easily like are plucked out, then you know it's ready to come off. Also, another design consideration, something to think about with bulbs, is you're going to have this kind of unsightly foliage. So when you're thinking about where you're going to put these bulbs, do take that into consideration as well. You do have, just very quickly, you have your hardy bulbs, which are the ones that can withstand the winter temperatures that perennialize. So those are the ones that you don't have to dig up. So some examples of that would be lilies and irises. And then you've got your semi-hardy, which are not as reliable. You may have to, you can mulch, leave them in the ground and mulch for that winter protection, and then just cross your fingers that they come back the next year. But that would be kind of your cannas, your agapanthus and dahlias as well. And then you've got your tender ones, which do not tolerate the severe freezing temperatures, and so oftentimes we dig these up in the fall and store in a cool, dry place, a basement or something like that, and then plant them back out in the garden. So elephant ear and caladium are two examples of this. Depending on the winter, we never know. You never know. But if you are going to store these in a cool, dry place, also very important to remember not to lump these together so that they don't rot. So if you're going to store them, to just kind of spread them out a little bit in a single layer, maybe not touching quite as much, so that they have that airspace around them so that they're not clumped together and moisture can build up. But again, a garage or a basement is a good place to store them. And we even have stored them, and I may be getting out of topic, and I can't remember, I think it's elephant ears. It's one of them that we actually had a bunch of them for our plant sale, and we were overwintering them, and they put them in sand to overwinter them. So, anyways, not sure why or what that did. We did have elephant ears. They didn't bloom for the plant sale, but they did come up. Yes.
Do you think dahlias need to be dug up in the fall?
Yes.
Yeah, they're kind of one of those iffy. I mean, if it's something that, especially the cut flower, really nice, you want to keep them. Yeah. Okay. Well. All right. So, yes.
What do you think is the best time to divide daffodils?
Best time to divide daffodils.
Spring, so before.
Fall.
Well, they're supposed to be planted in the fall. Well, yeah, why not, right?
Yeah, you can dig them up and then just kind of transplant them in a sense.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I do, so you guys being about an hour away, I don't have the information up here, but do want to make you guys aware that our plant sale, so our Master Gardener Association plant sale is coming up. It is Mother's Day weekend. It's the Friday and Saturday of Mother's Day weekend. I believe that's what, the 11th, May 11th, 10th and 11th, yes. And so it starts at 9 a.m. on Friday, and goes till 3, and then it starts at 9 a.m. on Saturday and goes till noon. Get there early for the best selection, but they're looking at about 11,000, 12,000 plants total. Really great prices if you've never been. Lots of perennials. They actually have several shrubs this year and small trees. I know that they have, I believe, redbuds and some dogwoods, some of the native dogwoods as well. Dug up some shrubs like I mentioned. Lots of perennials. So come check us out and help with our fundraiser.
What's the address?
Oh, it's 3309 Burlington Road
What's the date, please?
in Greensboro. It's May 10th and May 11th.
I'll include information about it in today's email.
Yeah, Greensboro. And it's just right off of 40. You get on Windover, and it's just right there. You don't even have to venture too far into Greensboro. It's about an hour. Yes.
Could you talk just a second about that, like annual chrysanthemums and things like that, so they'll bloom in the right time?
Ooh, chrysanthemums. There's a trick with those. You mean like planting chrysanthemums in the ground?
Yeah, they would stash that. I've got two old varieties in
Right. There's a trick to it. I don't know it off the top of my head. There is a publication on it as well, so I can look that info up and either get it with you or get it with Ashley. I